Robservations with Meyer Burnett.
And I've got something on my mind. As a matter of fact, what is that? Verisimilitude. It's not like it's not always on my mind, but verisimilitude. Something that appears, the feeling, the look, the appearance of reality. I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking about it a lot. You know why? Because I've been thinking about Lord of the Rings. Verisimilitude and Lord of the Rings. Is there such a thing? I've been thinking about it. I think there is. And certainly the books have verisimilitude, don't they? Because when you read a book, everything in a good book feels real, doesn't it? I always thought so. But anyway, I was reading an article that has to do with physical media. And as the pharaoh of physical media and thinking about verisimilitude and Lord of the Rings, when I find an article that brings two great tastes together, how could I not want to talk about it? And guess what? Guess what, everyone? I have just the thing to discuss. And this was an article that appeared on the 2nd in Wired. Now, I have to say, I'm a huge fan of Wired. I've loved Wired magazine, and now pretty much Wired online, but the magazine too. I've loved Wired. I think that Wired has been one of the great culture magazines of now almost 30 years. I find Wired to be indispensable in terms of articles about the modern age, delving into things. I love Wired, and there's always something of interest there. Well, they published a really interesting article that got me thinking, and heck, I'm going to share it with you, and perhaps it will get you thinking too. And here's the article. The article is The No Good, Very Nasty Remastering of The Lord of the Rings. Now, kudos to Jason Kihei. Is it Kihei? Jason Kihei, I think, or Kihei, who wrote this article. And, of course, he's referencing Alexander and the Terrible, Horrible, No Good, Very Bad Day, I think. Or maybe he's not, which is a favorite children's book. Of course, it was turned into a movie. Now it's going to be another movie. But so I read this. In correcting every imperfection and sharpening every blur of his epic fantasy trilogy, Peter Jackson has violated a fundamental law of nature. What does that mean? Of course, for those of you who don't know, or maybe you're not up on your physical media, Peter Jackson has indeed remastered the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the Hobbit trilogy in 4K for home entertainment release. Also, the entire soundtrack was now remastered in Atmos, and ooh, it's choice. There has been a lot of online scuttlebutt chatter about whether or not this 4K transfer is as good as it is, or is there a lot of DNR, meaning digital noise reduction? Have they screwed with the image too much? There's a lot of commentary on both sides. This, however, does not deal with that. This deals with something else. And I want to jump into it. Look, I see, this is by the article now, it's not me. Listen to this. Okay, here's of course, a picture of Arwen. The poorish, inconsistently color-graded, visually outdated images of Lord of the Rings work in a very literal but also cosmic sort of a way, because they look, by contemporary standards, imperfect, because they look blurry and out of date, like relics from the past. First of all, I don't know if I would agree with that assessment at all. Insomatic sends in a sticker, which I want to thank you, Insomatic, for as we start this chat. It's so strange. This poorish, inconsistently color-graded, visually outdated images of Lord of the Rings. No one who worked on the movie at the time, and I know this because I, of course, worked on the first two films extensively as a documentarian covering Fellowship of the Ring and The Two Towers for years. And I actually did a piece on the color grading of Fellowship, so I won't get into that, but you can watch it on the Fellowship extended versions of the Blu-rays or of the DVDs. And I'll get into this article. Look, I see why Peter Jackson did it. Why he re-released in December of last year his Lord of the Rings trilogy along with the nasty hobbitses, as I like to call them, channeling Gollum, in so-called 4K Ultra HD, a redundancy. It's a very 21st century filmmaker thing to do, this remastering business. Enrich the colors, sharpen the images, and your films hold up down through the ages. It's practically a moral obligation, a question of clarity, of being clear, and you can clarify Legolas by pumping an extra 10 million pixels into his perfect elven pores, which comes out something like 100 billion photons, all twinkling immortally through the cosmic sweep of space-time. Why then shouldn't you? Is there anything humans demand in this life? If there's anything humans demand in this life, it's that. Greater clarity. Just speak clearly, you scream at politicians, at therapists, at spouses, also at me for writing such a muddy first paragraph. God, it really is a mess. Sinful even, so wordy and wasteful. If clarity, like its cousin cleanliness, is indeed next to godliness, and it is, the word in the original Middle English meant glory, divine, and splendor, then to be unclear is to be unethical, or unoptical, as it were, since optics are the new ethics, at least in corporate America, where all they do is seek clarity on this, visibility into that. I mean, could I be any more clear? More than likely, so let me try. Here's how I should have started this essay. In 2020, everyone went a little bit blind. Because that was COVID for you, in a sense, a great glaring crisis of seeing. Stuck inside, people couldn't see as they were used to seeing. They couldn't see their friends and family except on screens. They couldn't see movies or shows or plays except on screens. And they couldn't see when the crisis would end, not even on screens. If this simulation called reality was crackling along in high def in the before times, it dropped to something like standard definition in 2020 when all glitchy and grainy. Sorry, this connection stinks. As the outside world blurred, though, the inside world up-resed. Screens were all that mattered, so they got sharper, prettier, denser, clearer. Everything you think had a record-breaking year in sales did. Big screen TVs with their UHDs and HDRs, iPhone 12s with their OLED displays and 5G speeds, Oculus Quest 2s now with 50% more pixels. Salvation would be achieved through clarity, and there was no resolution better suited to the times than something called 4K. Not a new standard, of course. It began to show up in the mid-2010s, but cocooning at home during the pandemic, as one industry exec put it, has accelerated interest in 4K. Let's recast the metaphor. HD was the caterpillar and 4K the butterfly, bursting forth from its COVID chrysalis and crystallizing entertainment at quadruple the pixel density. The colors were dazzling, a truly heightened display. Classics like Lawrence of Arabia and Hitchcock Collection, all the way down to every last Rambo and Resident Evil. By the way, I want to point out I have all of those that I got this year in 4K. We're 4K'd in 2020, not to mention video games, TV shows, and Top Gun to boot. Binge watchers had been blind, now they could see. So look, I get why Peter Jackson capitalized on the accelerated interest, why he remastered his trilogies in 4K and just in time for the holiday season of a year in which an acute crisis of seeing collided with a chronic resolution fetish to produce a new market for the illusion of reality. But let me be clear, crystal if I can, what a no-good, anti-human, unoptical thing for this man to do. Peter Jackson has never met a special effect he hasn't tried to perfect, from the non-technical and old-fashioned like forced perspective so Frodo looks small, to the next-gen and physics-defying like mocapping a bipedal human actor into a four-legged fire-breathing dragon. He's a master manipulator of bodies in space. In the case of Lord of the Rings, it worked. Magically, little people, convincingly and very emotionally, saved an enormous world. And then he made The Nasty Hobbitses. As a book, The Hobbit is everything Lord of the Rings is not. Short, silly, and stupid. Not that Jackson understood this. When he read it, he mainly saw that big, scary dragon. In fact, he has suggested that he couldn't make the films until the effects for such a beast were ready for him to exploit. Instead of thinking about how to make a story of an annoying middle-aged shut-in forced to venture outside actually, compellingly tellable, he was thinking visually and financially. It would be 3 movies then, silly, stupid, and not at all short. But that's not the worst part. The worst part is that he seems to think he succeeded. That the look of these movies, pixels flashing in 48 hyperreal frames per second, is enough to justify their existence. So much so that he'd come to look back on Lord of the Rings with regret. Over the years, the imperfection in his original trilogy began in his mind to show, hence the 4K remaster. Quote, "We got the opportunity to go back and to remove and paint out imperfections," he says in a promotional video for the new Blu-rays, as animators retouch the scene with the Balrog. "It's fun to have all the new toys. I shouldn't have all this stuff to play with in the old days. Now that he does, all 6 movies consist," Jackson says, "of pristine, sharp, ultra-crisp images." In her essay, which I'm going to get to later, in defense of the poor image, the filmmaker and media theorist Hito Steyerl, Steyerl, Steril, defines an imperfect cinema as resolutely compromised, blurred, amateurish, and full of artifacts. She's talking about underground, anti-elitist, anti-capitalist art, which Jackson's cinema is resolutely far from. But the poorish, inconsistently color-graded, visually outdated images of his first Lord of the Rings can be defended on similar grounds. The reason they work in a very literal but also cosmic sort of way is precisely because they look, by contemporary standards, imperfect, because they look blurry and out of date, like relics from the past. What humans perceive as the linear flow of time, first Jackson made The Lord of the Rings and then he made The Nasty Hobbitses, is tied very deeply, if most unfathomably, to the direction of entropy. If you saw Christopher Nolan's latest VFX showcase, Tenet, you might follow, or not. That empty excuse for a film won't make sense in any era at any time. What's known as this: the early universe had more order to it, and the universe today has less. The glass breaks, disorder increases, and time seems to move forward. But who's to say the broken glass or the much-invoked deck of cards that was arranged numerically and by color, but now is shuffled and therefore disordered, makes any less sense in its chaotic form? The notion of certain configurations being more peculiar than others, 26 red cards followed by 26 black cards, for example, makes sense only if I limit myself to noticing only certain aspects of the cards, in this case the colors, writes the theoretical physicist Carlo Rovelli in The Order of Time, like a brief history of, but beautifully written. If I distinguish between all the cards, the configurations are all equivalent. None of them is more or less particular than the others. Of course, the human brain cannot make such a fine-grained distinction. As the cards are shuffled, the brain loses track of any meaningful relationship between them. The patterns and peculiarities, once so apparent, are now said to blur. The difference between past and future, Rovelli writes, is deeply linked to this blurring. Confused? Let me try to be clearer. When things get unclear, you know time is passing. Blurring is the reason people can exist as physical beings in time. If your brain could somehow perceive a broken glass as a pattern identical to that of the unshattered glass, because on a subatomic level they basically are the same, you would transcend time, but you can't, so you're stuck here, living and inevitably dying in a world where the imperfectly perfect Nasty Hobbitses are the standard by which Peter Jackson judges his perfectly imperfect Lord of the Rings, where he remasters the latter in a style of the former, a violation of nature of the order of time. In a way, it's God's work. By fine-tuning his images, by increasing their resolution, Jackson is making the patterns easier to perceive. He's de-blurring the meaning behind the shuffled deck, sculpting richer life from the mud of the past. But Jackson is not God. He's a director of high fantasy, and that's the wrong genre to unentropically re-engineer. All stories should be allowed to get blurry in our memories of them, but fantasies most of all because they're so close to our dreams. We don't dream in high resolution. We wake up, and the dragons fade. Look, I can write a clear sentence. Peter Jackson should not have remastered Lord of the Rings. Here's another. COVID makes it hard to think about the future. Or I can write a blurred, amateurish essay instead, full of artifacts and stray thoughts, imperfections and improbabilities that might suggest something more. Something about vision, about seeing a way forward, something about heaven, and the unclarities that help get us there. So I read this article in Wired, and honestly, I kind of hated it. Because first of all, what you're talking about, what the author was talking about in this essay, is home video. It's video. He wasn't talking about the original camera elements. He wasn't talking about the original scanned or the negative, and how the negative was scanned in and meticulously manipulated, color, clarity, all of that originally. He's not talking about that. He's talking about specifically about this particular way of remastering films. And this kind of made me angry, only because, I mean, I love 4K, and as I just pointed out in the show that I was on, when the Beastmaster comes out in his beautiful, beautiful edition from Vinegar Syndrome, why wouldn't you want it in 4K? What is the point of having something in 4K? Well, 4K best replicates, hopefully, the original elements that were finished by the filmmakers. When you're remastering something in 4K, theoretically, you're not really changing it. I mean, you're changing the very medium it's on. You're changing it from being on celluloid with light being projected through it that shows up on a screen to being electronically presented across, well, an entirely different way of seeing. But what the whole point of 4K is supposed to do is most replicate the original source material as it was finished when the filmmakers made it in the first place. So this idea that somehow remastering something in 4K is bad, and the whole idea that, oh, things should be blurry because memories fade. Well, hopefully art doesn't. Should the Mona Lisa get blurry through time? I mean, I know the pyramids probably don't have as sharp edges as they used to because of wind and rain and the elements, but the pyramids are still here. Maybe the pyramids indeed are a little less or a little more blurry than they were when they began. But there's no reason to not want to see art in the highest resolution possible, to see it in the best possible format. Isn't that what we want? Don't we want the best experience of it? Now, there are times I have railed against things like colorization. I don't believe that if a movie was shot in black and white during the time it was made, should it be colorized? And I'm going to say something, and people are going to object to what I just said. They're going to say, didn't you just contradict yourself? And I'm going to say this. So, one of my favorite movies of all time, when I was a little kid, I've talked about this before, was 1953's the George Pall production of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, directed by Byron Haskin. It's one of my favorite, but still, one of my favorite movies of all time. When I was 5 years old, 6 years old, it blew my mind. I loved it so much because the Martians killed a priest, and if the Martians could kill a priest and God couldn't protect that priest, well then anything could happen. And that was that was an important lesson for a 5-year-old to learn. But anyway, watching that movie, the War Machines, the beautiful War Machines, as they ascended from the gully they crashed in, you could see all of the wires. You could see them all. The War Machine was held aloft by many wires, and they did what they could to hide those wires, but you could still see them, especially on home video. When they brightened up the image, you saw those wires, man, and they were there all for a long time. Now, in our digital age, War of the Worlds was remastered in 4K. It was released by 2 different video companies around the world, one being Criterion, the other being Insignia in Australia, and they released beautiful new versions of War of the Worlds. And one of the things that they did when they were remastering War of the Worlds was remove the wires, so you couldn't see them anymore. Now, a lot of people would say, well, Rob, isn't that meddling with the image? And I would say no. I would say no because at the time, they didn't want the wires to show. They hoped they wouldn't show. And they'd want them to go away if they could. So I don't think that taking the wires out of a remaster of 1953's War of the Worlds is a bad thing. I don't think so. I think that was a good thing, and I think it enhances the enjoyment of the film. On the other hand, now some people might say, well, Rob, a lot of filmmakers might have wanted to make their movies in color, but they didn't. They made them in black and white for whatever reason. So why shouldn't we colorize those movies? And I would say to you that you should not. Because at the time, first of all, people made black and white movies in the color era. Black and white is shot a specific way. The way films are lit, exposed. The filmmakers knew that they were making a black and white movie, so the way they were made was to be black and white. To colorize those movies is to actually mess around with the intent of the original filmmakers. Now, the intent of the original filmmakers in War of the Worlds was not to have their wires showing on the Martian war machines. They intended for the Martian war machines to not have wires because they're supposed to appear like real Martian war machines. And if they have wires on them, it betrays that illusion. We realize it's just a model being held aloft in a studio, in a soundstage, or on a miniature stage. And it shatters the verisimilitude of what you're watching. Now, a lot of people might say, well, Rob, how can a black and white movie have verisimilitude at all? Because the world isn't in black and white. Well, I would say, just like anything, verisimilitude is unto itself. So when you're watching a black and white movie and you know it's a black and white movie, there is no verisimilitude shattered because it's simply in black and white, because that's what it is. It is black and white. There's nothing, there's no other choice. It's a black and white movie. So you have to ask yourself, understanding that, do you believe what you're watching within the confines of that film? Do the characters seem believable? Does everything else within the proscenium of the frame, is it believable? I would say, well, if it is, then you have verisimilitude, and that's what you're seeking. That's what all filmmakers are seeking. Look, all movies are lies. They're all lies. 24 frames a second, they're lying to you. It's all made up. None of it's real. The films themselves are all lies, but the magic within a film, did it convey truth to you? Did all of those collective lies come together to create a truth of the human spirit, a truth of conveying something about human existence that is, in fact, true, that you can recognize as truth? Did it do that? That's what's amazing about movies, is if there is verisimilitude, if they make you believe, well, then they work. When you're making a high fantasy epic, do you think that Peter Jackson wanted the seams to show in his movies? No, he was trying to create Middle-earth to be an unbelievably real place. Now, of course, yes, he was limited. The Fellowship, they were made in 1999. They started shooting those movies 22 years ago. Oh my God, I'm so old. But he wanted them to be as real as possible. And ultimately, when he was done with The Hobbit, whether it should have been 3 movies or not is not for me to debate. They are 3 movies, so I'm not going to talk about shoulda, coulda, woulda. We have 3 Hobbit movies. And the idea of making all 6 movies work together as a piece is okay. Now, to me, when you're putting something on home video, you are translating the original film to another medium. So you are not, by definition, giving somebody an exact recreation or replication of what it was like to watch that movie in a theater. By the very definition of, it's not being projected. I mean, you could say, well, you got digital projection in a theater, which is closer to the truth if you're going to talk about manipulating images digitally. Because now most movies are digitally projected. But at the time, while they digitally graded The Hobbit, they still had a negative of it. I mean, of Lord of the Rings. But this idea of remastering movies in 4K, what they want to do is replicate the intentions of the original filmmakers at the time the movie was made. That's why one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of 4K is it gives you the ability to do that, to present the film. Like, look, the big frustrating thing about being a filmmaker is that when you were making an actual film and your film existed as a print, first of all, it's a different generation from the original negative, so it never looked exactly as sharp as the negative looked. And then when you go project it, every time you run it through a projector, the image is somehow diminished. There's dirt on it, hair, the changeover, the cigarette burns get a little raggedy. At the end of every reel, you'd see the celluloid get scratched. So for most of human history that we had cinema, you couldn't see movies in optimal presentations unless you saw, well, maybe the first show of a film. But every time you went back, it would be diminished a little bit. And who wants that? What filmmaker wants that? No filmmakers want that. So what 4K allows people to do, it allows filmmakers to go in and hopefully future-proof, preserve for the next generation, their films. Hopefully they'll stick around for a long time. They will be the best, the most optimal versions of those movies. Now, in the case of Peter Jackson, yes, the Lord of the Rings films, the first 3 Lord of the Rings films, were very iterative. They were an ongoing process. Sometimes if they needed a green screen shot, they would take a green screen out into the parking lot and shoot a horse and a rider rearing back so they could cut it into the movie. A lot of the movie was digitally altered. They did shoot it out in real locations, so the light was always changing, which is something that happens with anyone who's shooting on location. So this idea that somehow the degradation of the image, the fact that the images aren't as crisp or as clear as they could be, that adds to the verisimilitude of Lord of the Rings, well, that's debatable. But what I would think is that what you want to preserve is the intent of the filmmakers. No filmmakers want to have any of their images blurry, but sometimes they are. And there's nothing you can do about it. And I'll tell you, not one filmmaker who's ever had to use a blurry shot, whether that was the only take they had or whether it was the best take and that's the one that they went with, no filmmaker would ever say, I'd much rather have this shot as blurry as crystal clear. No filmmaker, no one who ever rolled film or digitally captured an image wants their image to be anything other than razor sharp. It does not add anything to see work diminished. You want to have it in the best light possible. Now, there have been people that have some very interesting analysis of the Lord of the Rings 4K transfers and the objections to using digital noise reduction. But there's always been objections to the Lord of the Rings transfers on home video, as there is to most transfers. Lately I've seen, for the first time in my life, I've seen transfers that finally, I've said on the show, whether it's Die Hard or whether it's The Matrix, seeing them in 4K, they finally look the way they're supposed to look on home video, which we never got before, even in HD, because some things just didn't translate that well. But in my mind, what you want as a filmmaker is to have the very best quality image. And the idea that our television signals, which were garbage for the most part, they couldn't replicate near what the resolution of film was. We were watching a very, very, very diminished image, even though we didn't really know how diminished it was. But going from basically our television standard, which was 640 by 480 pixels, and going up all the way to what we can get now, 4096 by 1716 pixels if you're watching a widescreen 4K presentation, it's amazing. It's amazing how far we've come. And I would say this idea, this sort of retro hipster idea that Peter Jackson, look, I'm not going to get into whether the Hobbit movies are good or not, but I don't like it when an article like this calls them stupid. Maybe it was stupid. I didn't think the original book was stupid. Just because a book is written for children doesn't mean it's stupid. And as far as children's books go, The Hobbit is a pretty good one. So I kind of thought this article was hipster nonsense. And in being that it was in Wired, it bothered me because I was like, come on, Wired, what are you doing? But anyway, I understand where this person kind of was coming from. I get this idea that you can say, oh, let's degrade the image. I don't want to see the best image the negative provided. I want to see an image that's a little crappier, so it makes me what? You feel better about the fact that it takes place in Middle-earth? That somehow there's more verisimilitude created when the image is shitty because it looks like an old-time photograph or something? I don't buy that. I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true at all, especially that's not what the intent was. The intent is always to create the best images possible, unless, of course, you're going for something artistic, like the invasion of Normandy in Schindler's List. They're using 45-degree angles on the shutters, or they're doing something different to create that combat photography look, in which case the image is being degraded, and it's also being whipped around as a combat photographer would to create more verisimilitude in that situation of storming the beaches at Dog One in Schindler's List. Now, here's another article that's referenced in this, I think it's sterile. I think it's Hito sterile. Sterile? Or sterile? I don't know. And this is the article here, and this is an interesting article. I'm not going to read this whole thing. but I'll put it in the, oops, I didn't mean to do that. I had to look it up. In defense of the poor image. I'm going to put this in the live chat, so if you all desire, you can all read this article along with me, because I'm not going to read the whole thing. But again, I kind of thought this article was poppycock. In defense of the poor image is a copy in motion. Its quality is bad, its resolution substandard. As it accelerates, it deteriorates. It is a ghost of an image, a preview, a thumbnail, an errant idea, an itinerant image distributed for free, squeezed through slow digital connections, compressed, reproduced, ripped, remixed, as well as copied and pasted onto other channels of distribution. A poor image is a rag or a rip, an AVI or a JPEG, a lumpen proletarian in the class society of appearances, ranked and valued according to its resolution. The poor image has been uploaded, downloaded, shared, reformatted, and re-edited. It transforms quality into accessibility, exhibition value into cult value, films into clips, contemplation into distraction. The image is liberated from the vaults of cinemas and archives and thrust into digital uncertainty at the expense of its own substance. The poor image tends toward abstraction. It is a visual idea in its very becoming. The poor image is an illicit fifth-generation bastard of original image. Its genealogy is dubious. Its file names are deliberately misspelled. It often defies patrimony, national culture, or indeed copyright. It is passed on as a lure, a decoy, an index, or as a reminder of its former visual self. It mocks the promises of digital technology. Not only is it often degraded to the point of being just a harried blur, one even doubts whether it could be called an image at all. Only digital technology could produce such a dilapidated image in the first place. Poor images are the contemporary wretched of the screen, the debris of audiovisual production, the trash that washes up on the digital economy's shores. They testify to the violent dislocation, transferals, and displacement of images, their acceleration and circulation within the vicious cycles of audiovisual capitalism. Poor images are dragged around the globe as commodities or their effigies, as gifts or as bounty. They spread pleasure or death threats, conspiracy theories or bootlegs, resistance or stultification. Poor images show the rare, the obvious, the unbelievable. That is, if we can still manage to decipher it. Look at that. And I'm just going to read this first part. Low resolutions. In one of Woody Allen's films, the main character is out of focus. It's not a technical problem, but some sort of disease that has befallen him. His image is constantly blurred. Since Alan's character is an actor, this becomes a major problem. He's unable to find work. His lack of definition turns into a material problem. Focus is defined as a class position, a position of ease and privilege, while being out of focus lowers one's value as an image. The contemporary hierarchy of images, however, is not only based on sharpness, but also and primarily on resolution. Just look at any electronics store, and this system, described by Harun Faraki in a notable 2007 interview, becomes immediately apparent. In the class society of images, cinema takes on the role of a flagship store. In flagship stores, high-end products are marked in an upscale environment. More affordable derivatives of the same image circulate as DVDs on broadcast television or online as poor images. Obviously, high-resolution image looks more brilliant and impressive, more mimetic and magic, more scary and seductive than a poor one. It is more rich, so to speak. Now even consumer formats are increasingly adapting to the tastes of cineasts and aesthetes, who insist on 35mm film as a guarantee of pristine visuality. The insistence upon analog film as the sole medium of visual importance resounded throughout discourses on cinema, almost regardless of their ideological inflection. It never mattered that these high-end economies of film production were, and still are, firmly anchored in systems of national culture, capitalist studio production, the cult of mostly male genius, and the original version, and thus are often conservative in their very structure. Resolution was fetishized as if its lack amounted to castration of the author. The cult of image gauge dominated even independent film production. The rich image established its own set of hierarchies, with new technologies offering more and more possibilities to creatively degrade it. Okay. I have to say, what a load of hooey. I mean, the whole point of making visual images if you want to make a visual image to convey. Now, I'm not saying degraded images or grainy images. There can be artistic intent behind all of them. But I will tell you, when you are making a film, whether it's Lord of the Rings, whether it's Star Wars, or whether it's Lawrence of Arabia, what everybody is looking for is to create the best images possible, the clearest, most visceral images possible, unless, of course, your intent, and we all know what that artistic intent is. I think the Omaha Beach attack in the beginning of Schindler's List is a perfect example. Sometimes you don't want to have your images because for whatever reason, a story or something, you want to show a memory, and the way you show or convey a memory is to show it being very black and white or grainy or something, in which case we're conveying that you're using a visual motif to create a memory. So you don't want it to be totally crisp and clear, but that doesn't work unless everything before it and after it is crisp and clear, so you can convey the idea that it is a memory. Well, when it comes to Lord of the Rings or any other film, what you want is you want it to look the best for the audience. How will the audience best be conveyed your movie? Now, I think sometimes, as in the case of Star Wars, the remastering of Star Wars that we saw beginning in 1997 was problematic because every time you cut to a completely CG-derived image or segment, such as Jabba the Hutt being intercut with Han Solo, it looked very jarring, and verisimilitude was shattered. One of the great things about the original Star Wars is that because most of it was shot on location with practical effects, until you cut to miniatures, but even the miniatures, they felt like they had verisimilitude to them because they were miniatures and they were shot that way. Seldom did you see miniature shots combined with live action elements, but when you did, even those were done pretty well. And what you're looking for is to create that kind of verisimilitude. So nowadays we live in a land where 4K best replicates film. And the way we basically see in 4K. So the idea that somehow images should be degraded for some kind of, I don't know, that it's to represent the proletariat, I don't believe in that at all. I know that in this day and age, with the kind of images that are available to all of us, we all want the best images possible. As a matter of fact, when we see images of ourselves that we've taken that we wish were better, we get the tools right on our phones to make them better, so I can insta that shit right away. And I think the idea that Peter Jackson, in creating the Lord of the Rings movies, is not trying to create the best visual experience he possibly can for his audience is absurd. There's nothing wrong with wanting your movie, your artwork, to look the best it can be. And in this day and age, we have the tools and we have the talent to make that possible. And I think when we live in that time, and the time we are living in now, and we can get rid of the wires on the Martian war machine, as opposed to leaving them, why wouldn't we get rid of those wires? If ultimately it helps the intent of the original movie, I don't believe colorizing a black and white film does that at all, because you can't effectively colorize a movie that was shot in black and white because it wasn't lit to be in color. It was lit to be black and white, and you'll never be able to change that. I mean, maybe at some point deep learning AI could, but why would you want to? I would hope that deep learning AI, if somebody asks an AI, hey, can you go in and colorize Casablanca forever, that an AI would say, nope, not going to do it. Not going to colorize your Casablanca, even though it's been colorized before. But the people that did that are idiots. And I think ultimately what's most important is to preserve the original intent of any art. Because ultimately, the people that are alive today, as much as they might have good intentions, unless you have people working on the original film when it was made back in 1939 or whenever it was made, whatever movie you're talking about, 41, unless they're coming back to help you put that film into a different medium, such as a 4K disc, well then, you shouldn't try and second guess or change the original intent of the artists. What you should try and do is to best preserve those intents as best you know how. And I just thought it was such a weird thing to say, look, I used to be a video pirate when I was a teenager. I copied movies. I went into movie theaters with a video camera, after paying off a manager or paying off a projectionist, or sometimes, or most of the time, both, and took a video camera that was 640 by 480 at best, and filmed a screen and tried to get some semblance of the movie theater experience recreated at home. But let me tell you, it was terrible and it never worked. And for a long, 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 long time, many years, I wish to God I had something that looked better than the god-awful bootleg videotapes I used to deal in. I mean, there were images of movies that were exactly like these articles said. You could barely see them. They were blurry. They were gauzy. They were noisy. And every single time I watched any of those images, and some of the time it was the only ones you could get. I had movies before like Star Wars or Fantasia or E.T. or Maniac, Joe Spinell in Maniac. I had that movie. I had a bootleg copy of Maniac before it even played on the West Coast. Did I feel guilty? No. Sorry, Bill Lustig. I apologize, but I did have it. But I always wanted it to be better. I wanted to see Tom Savini's gore effects in pristine quality that you can get now. And this idea that somehow degraded images are something to be sought after or lauded or whatever is ridiculous. The great thing about the world that we live in now is we can get the very best images possible. We can get films to look better than they looked even when they played in the theater for the first time, when you have colorists and post-production supervisors who know what they're doing. I don't want to go back to an age where images are not good. I never want to go back. I want the best images possible, forever, now and always. So I just thought it was interesting to me that don't diss on Peter Jackson because he wants to make his films look the best they can look. Wouldn't you?